Welcome to Vinland Saga, Viking historical fiction, written by Bjorn Wolfe, narrated by R.K. Marks, copyright 2023 by Audiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit Audiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. Alrek of the Viking Camps. For 4 days, the Wind Raven had been drifting aimlessly through a blinding mist, and the 5th day dawned with no signs of escape, which left the explorers struggling for entertainment. On the stern deck, the helmsman found solace in his ale horn, while the 20 crewmen below killed time with chess games. Meanwhile, the 20-odd boys who rounded out the crew had turned the bow into a swimming beach, swimming and frolicking with the energy of young seals. Their yellow heads bobbed around like a scattering of oranges on the murky water, while on the forecastle they chased each other giddily, their damp bodies shimmering like moths in the misty greyness. The first 2 benches were covered in clothing drifting aimlessly after those out of breath had paused to catch their breath. The centre of the jolly crew was a young man with brown hair, brown eyes, and brown cheeks, who told the story of Viking horseplay with a smile of delight. The laughter that followed his tale only stopped when one of the lads approached them with a sword, sending them running and dodging his thrusts. "Your noses are as blue as Gudrid's eyes," the newcomer sneered, sprinkling his companions with tosses of his soaking wet red hair. "Up and at 'em, Alrek of Norway! Let's have a bout to get our blood circulating." The brown-eyed boy looked around with little enthusiasm, while the others chimed in with a dismissive chorus. "There's more chance of you spilling your blood than getting Alrek's." Halad thought the same until he realized. Maybe the water has damaged Redhead's memory, so he thinks he won the dwarf's sword last winter. The red-haired boy turned red-cheeked, too, as his ill-discipline and temper were as easily stirred as his limbs. "If you're going to allow him to believe," he shouted, "that the 20 of us Greenlanders are scared to fight him because he was bred in a Viking camp while we're farm-raised, I will take on his challenge right here." He jutted out his chest, ready to yell the next set of words in defiance, but before he could find them, he was stopped by Alrek of Norway himself. "I shall not engage in battle with you, but I shall allow you to have your way with fencing," acquiesced the youthful Norseman, casually standing up and removing his cloak of crimson military fabric. Once revealed, it could be observed that he stood out among his peers for his martial posture in which he carried his broad, thin-bodied figure, in addition to the compact muscles that flexed beneath his polished skin with the sturdy elegance of a young feline. As he unearthed his weapon crafted by dwarves from within the mound of his garments, the Scarlet Warrior sprinted up to the forecastle, kicking aside ropes and clothes to create a space in the middle. The loungers pivoted themselves to face the deck and started clearing away the swimmers who arrived to witness the spectacle. Unquestionably, it was considered a sport in the beginning, seeing as the countryside-bred boy set the tempo to a swift tune that made the graceful swords practically kiss each other. They moved back and forth and up and down like a dance, defense answering attack so evenly that the ear grew attuned to the clang and rhythmically kept time to it as if it were a melody. However, after a while, the farm boy's lenience aggravated him, and he broke the cadence with an unexpected thrust. Eluding Alrek's shield, he opened a bloody gash on the brown skin of his chest. The latter endured it with a grin as peaceful as his swordsmanship, but his adversary was foolish enough to cry out in triumph. Alrek's expression transformed. When the Greenlander exploited that jab again, his sword collided with a violent force that shook his arm to the shoulder. In pain he swung aggressively. Alrek reciprocated. Gradually the smooth beat surrendered to sudden, brief and loud clanking, separated by pauses where the two danced around each other with mouths that were now square and eyes that were now burning. Once the clatter began, a short elderly man called Grimkel One-Eye and a lengthy young man named Hjalmar Thickskull, who had been playing chess behind the mast, stopped to pay attention. As the dispute persisted, the aged Grimkel vacated his post and sauntered towards the forecastle steps. He spotted bloodstains on the Greenlander's pale shoulders and signalled Norway's Alrek as a warning. However, the Viking boy didn't even acknowledge him. Silence had descended upon the spectators, so much so that the sound of bare feet scuffling and slapping against the boards echoed sickeningly in the stillness. The Greenlander's sword could not meet Alrek's blade as it swiftly cut through the air, tracing a new curve before the young Viking's intense gaze. To avoid being impaled, The Greenlander had no choice but to leap back, crashing into the gunwale with a loud thud. Witnessing this, a cry erupted from the onlookers. However, the young Viking remained resolutely focused, drawing back his arm to strike again with deadly accuracy. The Red One's recklessness would have resulted in his defeat if the old man had not intervened, springing onto the deck and holding Alrek back by the elbow. "You do remember that this is just a game, don't you?" growled the old man. If he required an answer, Alrek's savage force in freeing himself provided it, along with the intensity of his gaze before the meaning of the words finally registered, and he lowered his sword. "You're right," he muttered. "I had entirely forgotten." Turning back to the Greenlander in frustration, he demanded, "Why the devil didn't you remind me?" Although the Red One's body was covered in scratches and little blood remained on his cheeks, he continued to swagger. "I'm no coward," he proclaimed, but his voice broke on the last word, sounding almost hysterical. Grimkel decided to intervene with kindness, disguising it as gruffness. "You're a fool, which is worse," he barked, shoving the Red One down the steps as he gestured with his head for the others to disperse. "Get dressed, all of you. If you don't do it quickly, you'll face the consequences." After shaking his fist at them a few more times, he turned back to where Alrek was drying his weapon with a cloak. "You, listen," he called out. "I need to give you a warning." "You would do better to give the redhead a warning about provoking me again," responded the young Viking, still somewhat angry, but the one-eyed man paid him no heed. "Before, I have reminded you that your father was an outlaw." "Indeed it is true," Alrek agreed. 6 times have I listened to this story since I arrived in Greenland, even though I spent 8 years in the camps without ever hearing it. In Norway, people only remember that my father was the bravest of the Earl's Vikings. However, in Iceland, they remember that he was an outlaw before he became a Viking. You look so much like your father that every eye is on you, watching for the same rebelliousness he once possessed. I want to warn you that if you do not control this Viking fierceness, you will destroy yourself with Karlsefne, Grimkel said, admonishing the young Viking. Suddenly, Alrek laughed shortly. "Is it possible that I could receive less honor from him?" he mocked, speaking through tightly pursed lips. After a moment of silence, he stood straight to face the other man. His eyes were furious, and his voice was low with resentment. "I am Karlsefne's nephew, but I receive less honor and praise than his slaves. He pays more attention to his dogs than he does to me. I can't figure out what he wants from me. I think he hated my father." Grimkel scratched his bristly chin pensively. "Karlsefne is not known for his affection toward outlaws. He loves the law so much that he was called the Lawman, even before the chiefs who came with him on this journey appointed him as their chief in Vinland. However, it can't be denied that he disliked his brother. When they were young, they loved each other greatly. When your father Ingolf broke the laws in Iceland, Karlsefne gave half of his property to pay the fine, and when Ingolf died, Karlsefne took you in as his own, where he displays daily that he dishonors me for being his brother's son," Alrek concluded. With explosive impatience, the old man spat over the gunwale. "You foolish boy! He neither holds you in honor nor in dishonor yet. He only waits to see what you will earn." The boy's understanding grew slowly, and he turned away to kick at a pile of walrus-hide thongs coiled on the deck in front of him. The old man expressed his plea with deep sincerity. "You cannot claim that this is unwarranted. You have the power to choose whatever you desire. As for me, I firmly believe that you will honor to his name in every way. It is because of this belief and my love for your father, whom I taught spear-throwing when he was your age, that I have come to you." Alrek responded after a lengthy pause. "I am grateful for your kindness." His words were brief, and he finished his exercises in silence before descending the steps. However, Grimkel could tell from the look in his eyes that Alrek had finally comprehended the complexity of his position. Chapter 2, in which the boys of the Wind Raven consider the chances of finding a Skraeling. Meanwhile, an event was unfolding in the rear of the ship. Using his communication device, the helmsman detected a breach in the fog, exposing a shoreline that tapered off in the distance with a crest resembling a cumulus orb. "It's the Cape of the Crosses," he announced, igniting a chain reaction of excitement among his crewmates. "The Cape of the Crosses, our final destination!" The sailors cheered, hastily hoisting their sails and redirecting their vessel toward the opening. As the group of 20 young men busily fastened knives onto their deerskin tunics, they became increasingly eager for the thrill of the impending arrival. They soon began playfully bickering with the Red One, whose discomfort from his injuries made him particularly fractious. By the time Alrek had situated himself into his tunic and clasped on his beautiful weapon, earning him the moniker of the Sword-Bearer, he had to dodge insignificant objects thrown in his direction in order to join his companions. It was only with the assistance of the stoutly handsome Erlend the Amiable that the group was able to restore tranquility amongst themselves. We were discussing the prospect of disembarking tomorrow and contemplating whether or not the indigenous inhabitants, the Skraelings, may still be present, Erlend explained when the commotion had died down. Alrek was intrigued by the idea. Walking over and settling himself onto Erlend's bench, he reclined upon it and rested his head against Erlend's bright blue cloak. "I had completely forgotten," he whispered. "It was at this site where Thorwald Eriksson was killed by the locals, shortly after he discovered 3 boats with 3 men concealed beneath them." "What nonsense are you spewing?" Ketil the Glib interrupted. "It wasn't the local residents who killed him. He killed all of them except for one individual who fled in a boat. Thorwald was struck down with arrows by the forces that the escapee had returned with, until—" Ketil was silenced by a blow from a fragment of sailcloth tossed by the red-haired lad. "Garrulous fool! Alrek was informed of that tale long before you were able to even open your clam," the Red One muttered derisively. "Speak up, Alrek, and disclose if you believe that we will observe any Skraelings." The sword-bearer raised his shoulders in a shrug. "You should have the best judgment about that, Brand Erlingsson, for you were visiting your brother Rolf at Bratalid when Thorwald's men brought back the news of his death. You know whether or not they believe that Skraelings live on the Cape." The Red One, who also went by the name Brand Erlingsson, responded earnestly, saying that Thorwald's men did not believe that the creatures lived there, but inhabited the mainland and only visited the Cape for clams or something. The Cape was no more than a thin strip of land that ended in a kind of crossbar, composed of a beach connecting 2 hills, and it could not possibly have anything of interest on it, whereas if they could go on to Keel Cape. But there the shell shower recommenced, amid a protesting chorus. "Don't let him get started. End his noise. He is always sputtering." And Strong Domar extinguished the last sputter with a wild whoop as he threw up his cap in celebration. "However it stands, our chance for catching some there on a visit is as good as Thorwald's. Luck be with us," he shouted, whereupon he threw up his neighbour's cap, being much given to good-natured jests of the fists, and the jubilee would have been general if it had not suddenly been discovered that Alrek was slowly shaking his head on its blue pillow. "Why not?" they paused to demand. When he had taken his full time chewing and swallowing a mouthful of nuts, he told them, "Because we lack Thorwald's energy at the helm. He went ashore so soon after he cast anchor that the men on the Cape did not have time to get away. We shall stay quiet a whole night after we come to anchor. If any Skraelings should be there, they would have plenty of light to see us by, and the whole night to escape. Little danger is there that the weathercock will break the lawman's order to keep peace with the inhabitants, but if Karlsefni is to be any better off about news of them, he will find it necessary to put a shrewder man at the steering oar." The celebration was cut short. There was no denying the argument or fixing the fact. They took solace in blaming the helmsman and then went back to munching on nuts from the storage beneath the benches. In the quiet, Brand of Greenland found an opening to express his dissatisfaction. "These voyages will not bring us any good, not with the weathercock steering," he exclaimed, flicking the hair from his impatient eyes. "For 5 months we've only gone ashore when there was no chance for adventure. I'm tired of this monotony. I could gnaw at the edge of the boat like a horse in a stable. I'd sooner paddle back to Greenland in a skin boat than make another voyage under his leadership." Everyone agreed with him, yet still jeered through their mouthfuls. Even his loyal younger brother, Olaf the Fair, wore a merry face under his yellow curls. "You're speaking small words. Say that you would build a dragon ship and have sole power over it," he teased, then scrambled out of reach as Brand turned to him. "Well, I could." The Red One defied the universe. "King Half owned a ship and led a band when he was just 12 winters old." Jeers cut him short. "King Half? He'll say he's like Olaf Tryggvason next. You great donkey, you! No calf, with the milk of his kinsman's dairy farm still in him," cried the mouths that weren't occupied, while the full ones grinned widely. Only Alrek, smiling at the sky, said whimsically, "Let me travel with you when it's built, champion. I'd like to be on a ship that follows my command. I'd like to go ashore tonight to see Thorwald Eriksson's grave. The huntsman once told me, when I laughed at his magic, that if I ever stood beside a grave in the middle of the night, I'd learn what fear was. I've been wanting to prove him wrong, but there's no other grave in the new land besides Thorwald's. If we were on your ship now—" Gard the Ugly pondered aloud from his bench as he worked on fishnets. What is the downside of swimming? Though he was free now, his trace of thrall blood kept his hands always occupied. Alrek hesitated before answering. Halad, Bjorn's foster son, took that approach once, but even though he went out with the huntsman this summer, he's hardly considered brave. Still, I'm willing to try it. We can jump overboard right after dark and explore the beach until midnight. I would give anything to get these knots out of my legs. Will you come with me? Alrek lazily looked to the horizon, where a second hazy mass had appeared. Why not? He replied, but I'm not too keen on the swimming part. I find that deerskin dries more easily on deer than on me. Since the harbour is supposed to be shallow, we're unlikely to anchor near land, so we'll use the small boat. We can lower it without much fuss if there's no moon while the men are drinking aft. Gard rose, slapping Alrek on the back, sealing the agreement. Even the scoffers quieted down when Erland showed interest. What if you don't get the chance to tell the huntsman about your experience? He asked. It's entirely possible he won't come back from his trip to the South Country. Is it worth the effort? A man must take risks to avoid getting fat, Alrek joked, prodding Erland in his soft belly. The amiable one became the group's target of good-natured banter. Gard put his arm around the sword-bearer and drew him closer, pointing out the sight of land. The terrain emerged in bits and pieces, gradually revealing itself through the gentle haze of the sunset. Advancing towards it on the gusts of wind, soon the crescent shape of a harbour appeared beyond the cape. The hills within the cape became visible from their reclusive position beyond the seaward knoll. Following this sight, a ribbon of white sand unfurled between them. Eventually the entire scene began to exude its colour, as shades of grey faded into greyish-green and brown and red. Meanwhile, the frigid glitter along the shoreline transformed into a faint yellow. In the dwindling light it rested quietly and silently, the sun bidding it farewell with a languid grin. As the steersman commanded the sail to be lowered and the anchor to be thrown overboard, the small vessel nestled into its spot with a contented sigh. Chapter 3. Relating how one was found on the Cape of the Crosses. As the crew whiled away their evening over ale at the stern, two companions rowed away from the ship's stem. Contentedly they drifted in silence, enjoying the boat's rhythm and motion. Finally, the silence broke. Your countryman, the huntsman, knows all kinds of weird matters, reminisced Alrek. Do you remember the time we found him mumbling to Thor? Gard grunted in reply. If that's what Thor has to offer, then I'd rather go without. The last time I ate at his house I got sick. He'd be foolish to go where the Skrælings abound. The huntsman only went with 3 men and 1 small boat. Alrek shrugged, indifferent. If he doesn't come back, I won't shed a tear. The pair fell back into silence, which remained unbroken until they neared land. Stolen away in the dusk, the boat's glint guided them toward a pebble-strewn shore. Ashore, they tripped over fist-big rocks before finding their way to a grove at the summit. Who cares about the sight, so long as he can feel the earth beneath him? Exclaimed Gard. Suddenly he dropped onto the ground covered in leaves and began to roll freely, like a horse that had just been released from a tight girth. Alrek stretched his cramped muscles through a somersault. The damp leaf mold's fragrance seemed to intoxicate them. Soon they turned to whirling on their hands, then to jumping, and eventually they began wrestling. The shadows had grown a finger's length before they paused to catch their breath. They realized where they were, in a grove that wasn't too dense, overlooking the sea where 2 bleached wood crosses stood in an open space. Fan-like pine boughs swayed around the crosses as the winds from the sea howled against them. The only sound they could hear was the waves crashing against the nearby sand. The lads' hearts skipped a beat as they came to know where they stood. This was Thorwald's grave atop the cape. Gard's voice was tinged with awe. Thorwald believed this cape to be a great place to live in. I wonder how he enjoys being dead here. It must seem eerily quiet to him after the din of battle he faced in life. And his men, sailing away, leaving him alone as the only white man on this side of the ocean, must have been strange indeed. Alrek spoke softly. He must have spent 4 lonesome winters lying here. If he could hear our voices, his heart would welcome the sound. I wouldn't be surprised if we found him sitting on his grave when we returned at midnight. If we told him that we were his comrades' sons and shared all the news with him, he might— Gard's hand landed on Alrek's arm. Shh, he whispered urgently. I don't care what anyone says on board a ship, but here, what if he's listening and takes you at your word? Bran says he'd rather have his arm chopped off than go into a witch's den like Leif's Englishman did. A witch's temper is more reliable than a dead man's. I'm not eager to shake his bony hand, are you? Let's go down to the beach, but first I need to find the knife I dropped. Can you feel around that bush for me while I look over the slope?" "Sure," Alrek agreed, and gingerly made his way over the uneven terrain to the area where a clump of sumacs bordered the crown of the hill, descending to the beach. However, before he could search for the knife, he stopped and scanned his surroundings. To his left, the ship's distant torches glimmered like a streak of light against the grey sky. Below him, the beach stretched out, disappearing into the shadow cast by a tree-covered hill. Squinting, he looked hard and leaned forward. He blinked and did it again. It appeared as if a light in the shadows had opened up like an eye. It was not originating from the ship. He looked back to verify. The source of the light was from the hill, across the beach, a dim, unblinking eye that had previously been obscured by something. For a moment he wondered if it was a fire ignited by ghosts, and a chill ran down his spine. Then he remembered, and it hit him like a bolt of lightning, the Skraelings. Some had been ensnared and not yet freed, and it was up to him to locate them, to accomplish what others before him could not, to be the one to provide Karlsefne with the intelligence he required. How surprising that any memory of the knife, even of Gard's existence, vanished from his mind as fast as dew vanishes from a shield. He was compelled to dig his nails sharply into his flesh to get a hold of his excitement. "I shall ruin my opportunity if I approach too eagerly," he chided himself. "Karlsefne had ordered us not to offend them. I must navigate the situation so that I can observe them without being seen. But taking too long is also not wise, or they will have escaped." He began to move his body while his mind was still in debate, but he did not become any less cautious. He kept every inch of himself within the shadows of the pines, and did not venture onto the beach until he was certain it was safe. The only things that could provide cover were the low hummocks, dotted with tough patches of grass, that arranged themselves like a broken chain between the hills. He crawled from one link to the next, stealthy as a snake. When the links were absent and the sands gleamed, he would run crouching with the fleet-footed quickness of a fox, expecting arrows to whiz past his ears at any moment. However, none came, and eventually the dark shadow of the second knoll's spreading boughs enclosed him like a canopy. He paused there to listen. Once a distant tree sang a tentative owl's lament, and once he thought he heard branches rustling under cautious footsteps. Then it all fell silent, except the sound of waves crashing into the shore. He took hold of a twisted root that descended like a writhing arm and silently pulled himself up the slope. At the place where it flattened to the crest, a group of sassafras seedlings formed a fragrant shield. Once he had listened and verified that it was still undisturbed, he ventured to peek between the branches. So long did he remain there without moving that the insects he had startled began walking over him again in their undisturbed routines. The little area was empty. Except for the ash remnants and the piles of clamshells, there was no evidence to prove that any creatures had ever resided there. As a final measure, he hung his helmet on his sword and showed it cautiously above the foliage, and the imitation drew no arrows from the bushes beyond the flames. The area appeared to be completely deserted. It is not too much to say that his disappointment brought him near to tears. "They must have run away as soon as darkness fell," he muttered, and pushing into the open, he sent the shells flying before a savage kick. "What troll's luck!" As the words left his lips, the flying shells uncovered a peculiar bowl-shaped basket woven of reeds. He stooped to it curiously. Then, even as his fingers closed on the rim, he took another step forward, staring at the bushes that hedged the further side of the open space. "It appears that someone has plunged through here in a hurry," he told himself. "The branches are bent as if Odin—" There was no need of finishing his thought. His eyes had the answer before them, a shaggy figure crouching among the bushes, so motionless that it might have passed for one of them. For an instant he also stood motionless, staring back at the eyes that he could feel without seeing. Then Viking training flashed two thoughts to his brain, that the creature was aiming at him from the darkness, and that he must lose no time in advancing. Clutching his sword hilt, he sprang forward. After that, there was no chance for reflection. For a second the blade stuck, and in the delay, a copper-coloured arm shot out and fastened on his wrist, while the other copper-coloured arm brandished a stone hatchet over his head. With his left hand, he caught that arm and held it off, and they swayed, panting in the firelight that gave him his first glimpse of the foe that all sailors talked about, the bristling black hair and wide-rimmed beast-bright eyes, and the skin of unearthly hue showing under the animal hides of the covering. Under the copper-coloured skin, the muscles were like copper wire. Strong as he was, Alrek could not twist aside that wrist above his head. He gave up trying and limited his efforts to freeing his sword arm. Putting all his force into the wrench, he succeeded at last in loosening it and shooting forth his weapon, and that was all that he had to do. At the bare sight of it, glittering from its sheath like lightning from a cloud, the Skraeling uttered a yell of terror, dropped the hatchet from his hand, Alrek's wrist from hold, and flung himself back into the darkness. There was a crackling of brush, the spat of bare feet upon sand, and then silence. Gradually the sword-bearer's amazement gave way to amusement. He believed it was sorcery. How amusing, he whispered. Had Thorwald only shown them steel, he may have scared off the entire swarm. I could not have taken the hatchet away from him. I'm certain that my kinswoman Gudrid will be shocked when I reveal this. The sword-bearer leaned in towards the fire, surveying the weapon with great care and observing that the edge was razor-sharp. "It would have sliced me as if I were butter," he muttered to himself, while wobbling from his heightened excitement. Just then he heard the sound of feet scrambling up the slope, which signalled the arrival of guard. The ugly one was bewildered at first, squinting in the light of the fire, and then his face turning to that of utter disapprobation. "You frightened them off before I had a chance to see them. Ran away because you could and left me behind with nothing?" he bellowed. "I would have never thought you could do such a thing." Alrek held up his hands in honest regret. "Please forgive me, guard. It's true. When I first observed the light, I overlooked the fact that you were still with me, and I had the fear that the Skraelings would have gotten away before I could see them. I was only planning on getting up there to look, without—" He stopped abruptly, his mouth agape as he gazed at Gard. Instinctively Gard spun around to glimpse over his shoulder, but nothing noteworthy was there. "What's wrong with you? Have you gone insane?" shouted the sword-bearer. Alrek managed to regain his composure by laughing softly. "I think I have," he replied. "Do you know what else I forgot besides you? I forgot Karlsefne's order to maintain peace." Chapter 4, wherein the sword-bearer is further reminded that he has broken the law. The return to the Windraven was a time for reflection. Gard expressed regret for not having had a part in the prior adventure. Alrek responded with skepticism, stating that the Skraeling could return with a host as what had happened to Thorwald. Gard acknowledged his mistake, and a silence fell upon them until they reached the ship. Then the voices of welcome filled the air with suppressed excitement. Once aboard, the mood changed. Everyone wanted to hear about what had happened, but Gard refused to share. Alrek inquired about the weathercock, and Erland reported that he still had his wits about him. Alrek declined to share the news with the group, but told them they could follow him if they wanted to hear it. The group obediently fell into line and marched aft with Alrek.